evening. This is Justin Ford for From the Frontline. Tonight, the question under discussion is, what is going on in the Congo? In the studio with me is Dr. Peter Hammond, the founder of Frontline Fellowship, who has been involved in serving persecuted Christians for over 40 years in 38 countries. Dr. Hammond, what is going on in the Congo?
Well, some of the news headlines are M23 rebels are closing in on the mineral-rich city of Goma in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. Just love it when you hear the word democratic in a title. It normally means it isn't. There's nothing resembling democracy in the Congo. It is a completely failed state. So Democratic Republic of the Congo suggests there's a republic in it, there's some form of government, but it's a completely failed state. So much so that there's foreign troops from multiple countries, about 11 different countries, embroiled in the conflicts there. There's so-called United Nations peacekeepers who sometimes cause more havoc, rapes, murders, and looting than even the so-called rebels in these areas. So this is a pandemonium chaos state. To call it the Democratic Republic is just ridiculous. It's an insult to the term republic, just for starters. But thousands have fled the city of Goma in the face of the advance of these so-called rebels. And soldiers from South Africa have been killed, Malawi, Uruguay, in fierce fighting. You know, what are foreign troops doing there anyway? But the M23 rebels are continuing their advance in eastern DRC. There's bodies on the streets. Hospitals are struggling to cope with the number of casualties rising. And this is one of the largest cities in the Congo. It's a city of over 2 million residents and more than 500,000 displaced people or refugees. So it's a large city that's fallen to so-called rebels, and I should say by the so-called government. And I don't think the government's much of a government, and I'm not too sure if the rebels are that much of rebels under the circumstances. So it's plainly a lot of chaos. And just to make things more interesting, in the capital city of Kinshasa, which is far away on the other side of the country, there are protesters criticizing the international inactivity by attacking the embassies of the United States, of course, France and Belgium, of course, and even Rwanda, which is not so much, of course, but attacking embassies because of chaos in their own country, in the capital city.
So who are the M23 rebels and what are they fighting for?
Well, that's intriguing. The M23 rebellion is an armed conflict in North Kivu. The Kivu is one of the Great Lakes. So you've got the Lake Kivu is, along with Lake Tanganyika and some of these other lakes, are plainly part of the source of the Nile. So just think of the search for the source of the Nile. Well, this is one of the sources of the Nile, Lake Kivu, which Lake Kivu is the boundary also between Rwanda and the Congo. And the town of Kivu, the town of Goma, is at the northeastern part of Lake Kivu. So it's in fact on the border of Rwanda. And it's not far from the border of Uganda either. It's in that corner. So basically you look up at the map, you can see where Uganda is, you can see where Rwanda is. Well, not far from the border of Uganda and close, if not on the border of Rwanda, is the town of Goma. So it's this massive city actually on the lake Kivu, one of the sources of the Nile, high up in the mountains. This is the sort of area where you can find the gorillas in the mist. You know, the hairy gorillas. I'm not talking about the ones with AK-47s. And this is a beautiful part of the world, but the M23 troops are actually part of the Second Congo War of 2003. And basically the M23 rebels are in many cases Rwandese who were displaced. This is a continuation of the ongoing fallout of a 30 years war. So what you've got is the Interahamwe mass murdering thugs of the Hutu tribe who murdered hundreds of thousands of Tutsi during the Rwandese war, during the genocide in Rwanda. Many of the Interahamwe mass murderers fled to the Congo, and then they started to reorganize, to organize more terrorist attacks back into Uganda. And so understandably, Uganda started to organize counter activities, and the M23 rebels are a movement. It's from March 23 movement. The M23 means March 23rd. So they started March 23rd of 2012, and they are a movement of troops, in many cases deserters from different fighting forces, but many of them are actually Rwandese and even Ugandans who are of Tutsi origin, who want to prevent a reoccurrence of the genocide of 1994. And so they are targeting the Hutu Interahamwe mass murderers, the genocidal characters who caused the genocide, to prevent them from reorganizing and being a threat to Uganda or to Rwanda again. And that's why they get support from the Rwandan government and even the Ugandan armed forces. So they're not exactly rebels. In many cases, they are a force, or you could say, of preemptive measures that are being organized by both Rwanda and Uganda to prevent their population being targeted by these terrorists again. So it's slightly complicated, but you've got with the so-called M23, they are more soldiers than much of the government forces. And the evidence for this is at one point, M23 rebels gained control of Goma back in 2013. And when the government forces came in, it's the government forces of the Congo that did all the raping, murdering. The largest mass rape ever dealt with by international court is what was done by the government forces there. So, language is a bit fluid and complicated here. What they call the rebels in many cases are pretty disciplined soldiers, and what they call a government force are an undisciplined force of rapists, murderers, thieves, looters, and so on. So don't believe the terminology. When they speak about the government troops, don't think of well-organized, disciplined troops with ironed uniforms and polished boots marching in order. They actually more look like the terrorists and the rebels than the so-called rebels. The rebels look more like an army, actually, so it's very confusing.
Why are there international soldiers, including South African National Defence Force troops, in the Congo?
Well, that is an excellent question, and I think everyone should be asking their governments, why are our soldiers in the Congo in the first place? And the short answer is diamonds and cobalt and manganese and very valuable minerals. Goma is a mineral-rich area. It's in East Kivu, which is seriously mineral-rich in those mountains there. And so what you can see going on here is all the government forces from about 11 different countries in Africa that are involved in a war in the Congo are there for commercial purposes of their governments, and it's not normally of a legitimate commercial enterprise. It's normally something to do with private diamond mines owned by some cabinet minister or some body in this Politburo or another. So why are they there? Well, even the Zimbabwe army is in the Congo, and you would have thought, what the dickens are they doing there? And they're there because the ZANU-PF thugs, Mnangagwa and before him Mugabe, have personal diamond mines in the Congo. When people speak about exploitation, you have no idea about exploitation till you see what some of these communist and socialist governments are today involved in. They complain about what Belgium did, but actually when Belgium was there, they were building schools, roads, railways, hospitals, dams, electricity, plumbing. The Belgian government built up the Congo, and they were called exploitative, and yet they were investing in the education, the health, doubling people's life expectancy, things like this, bringing in glasses so that people could see well and all that sort of thing. And now the present group of liberators, they're the ones who are just looting, raping, murdering, stripping the society of its riches and putting nothing back into the area at all, unless you call venereal disease a contribution to the culture.
Can you help us understand something of the history of the Congo to provide the background and context for this present crisis?
Yes, if you want to go back, the Congo was the original heart of darkness. So you've got Henry Morton Stanley was the one who really explored the Congo the best. And his book, Through the Dark Continent, is a real eye-opener. The whole area, the Great Lakes area and the Congo River, which is one of the biggest rivers in the world in terms of volume. It's not the longest river in the world, the Nile is, but it's one of the biggest. During rainy season, some parts of the Congo River can swell to 17 miles in width. That's just a phenomenal amount of water. And Headwaters are in the mountains and the Mountains of the Moon, which is basically the border of Uganda, Rwanda, and the Congo, where the gorillas are. And this water flows all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And it's been a place of cannibalism, slave raids, genocidal warfare for centuries. And this was all exposed by Henry Morton Stanley, probably the most famous journalist of all time, the one who, after trekking across Africa on the lakes of Lake Tanganyika, met David Livingstone and shook his hand saying, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," which, well, I mean, the only two white men between the Nile River and the Limpopo, pretty fair guess. And with that most understated of comments and his journalistic coup of the 19th century, the interview with David Livingstone, the lost explorer, not that the explorer was lost, but the rest of the world didn't know where he was. As Henry Morton Stanley said, he knew where he was, we just didn't know where he was. And so Henry Morton Stanley exposed a society completely debased into cannibalism, intertribal genocide, slavery, and all the rest of it. And he fought an incredible 50-odd firefights, conflicts against slave traders and cannibals who were wanting to eat him as he tried to explore down the Congo River to the ocean, and an unbelievable 999 days battle against insuperable odds. Well, when Henry Morton Stanley pointed out and documented what was going on in the Congo, there was no country in Europe willing to take on the Congo. I mean, it was the heart of darkness. Who wants to take the responsibility to civilize one of the most savage, uncivilized, remote areas on the planet? And there didn't seem to be any motivation to do it. At that stage, nobody knew how rich it was in terms of minerals and all that. It just looked like a lot of problems. And not even the Belgian government was interested, but the king of the Belgians, King Leopold, put up his personal fortune, bankrupted himself to create the Congo Free State. Now, the Congo Free State worked quite well when Henry Morton Stanley was personally running it. But when he had to withdraw, and his chosen successor was going to be General Charles Gordon, but General Charles Gordon was at that moment not available because he had seen the need to go back to the Sudan to end the Mahdi's uprising, which was re-enslaving people that he had set free when he was governor of Sudan. And so he didn't know if he was coming back. And so Stanley wanted Charles Gordon to be the next governor of the Congo Free State, but he wasn't available. He was on a almost suicide mission to fight the slave traders in Sudan. And I don't think people appreciate just how much sacrifice was made, lives and blood, in order to end the slave trade and bring civilization to Africa. I know that these people often besmirched, and today King Leopold is universally derided and condemned as one of the worst people in history. But in his lifetime, King Leopold was applauded as one of the greatest humanitarians in the world, because he had put his personal finance into creating a free state for people who had been enslaved and wiped out and eaten by their neighbors for so long. And so the Congo Free State was a phenomenal operation. And only once they got control and stability in the Congo, then the Belgian government suddenly was willing to get involved and took it over from King Leopold, which was just as well, because he was now bankrupt and had nothing more to pour into this bottomless pit of need. And to create the roads, the railways, the stations, everything that was needed, schools, hospitals in the Congo, was one monumental operation. And there were some exploitative, what do we call them, corporations, sort of like the Black Rocks of that day, who got involved. And there were some ruthless individuals who came into Congo and gave the Congo Free State a bad name, particularly under Belgians. But generally speaking, the Congo was a success story. They took people in almost Stone Age savagery and brought them into civilization into the 19th century and then later into the 20th century. So that the Congo has one of the largest populations of Christians in the world today. And you wouldn't know it by how badly the government's run, but unfortunately, it's no democracy. You can call it the Democratic Republic, but obviously it isn't democratic or a republic, anything. And I've ministered in the Congo, and you can see the wreckage, the ruins of what was once a great civilization built up by the Belgians. But sadly, it has been wrecked by so much exploitation. There was a time that Arab slave traders were going berserk in there, but then the Americans, and you've got to blame the American government for the mess here, particularly Eisenhower. Eisenhower's government bullied the Belgians horribly to withdraw as part of their decolonization process. One of America's highest foreign policy goals after the Second World War and betraying Eastern Europe in the hands of the Soviets was to get the Europeans out of Africa. And what this did was remove the stable partnership that was between European nations and African nations, just taking, for example, Belgium and the Congo, and kicking them out. And, of course, the people in the Congo weren't ready. And the Belgians did tell Americans that, but the Americans didn't care. You've got to go. Time for colonialism is over. So 1960, the Belgians packed up their bags and got on their planes or ships and headed back to Belgium. And behind them was chaos, insurrections, revolutions, coups d'etats, assassinations, mass murder, mass rapes of nuns. You couldn't believe the savagery that exploded. You just have to use words like the Simba. The Simba were a revolutionary group backed by Red China who rampaged across, and one of the first books I read as a brand new Christian was Out of the Mouths of the Lions. And it's a story of hundreds of missionaries who were captured at the very place where our missionary is right now, Kisangani. It was then called Stanleyville, the highest navigatable point on the Congo River. And so nearly 2,000 kilometers from the sea. And at Stanleyville, they literally lined up hundreds of missionaries and started doing human sacrifice of these missionaries in front of a huge portrait in the center of town of Patrice Lumumba, the first communist dictator of the Congo, who, of course, the Americans pushed in there. And the Soviets had a terrorist training school in Moscow for many years called the Patrice Lumumba University, which is where they trained revolutionaries to be terrorists in Africa. And I've even had and recruited people who had been trained at Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow join our mission and work for us in Mozambique as evangelists. So we know quite a bit about it. But they literally sacrificed hundreds of missionaries and their children and wives, butchered in different ways. And it was South African and Rhodesian mercenaries under Mike Hoare, Colonel Mike Hoare, or Mad Mike as they called him, who went in and in a bunch of Land Rovers and Jeeps and rescued these missionaries and saved hundreds of lives. The Belgian paratroopers were days late. The French Foreign Legion were more than a week late. But the South African and Rhodesian mercenaries, much abused though they were and slandered in the press, but they saved the lives of these civilians, the nuns, the missionaries, the evangelists that were in the Congo, from this butchery in the name of Patrice Lumumba. So the Congos had a pretty savage background, and even worse after the so-called independence of 1960. And as one diplomat described it, independence in the Congo is something like giving a teenager a bottle of whiskey, a shotgun, and the keys to your car. And they certainly wrecked it all. It was an absolute total pandemonium, chaos. And if you want some idea of it, you could read the book, which was banned at the time, by Wilbur Smith. Wilbur Smith did The Dark of the Sun, which is a fictional novel based on the first rebellions going on in the Congo back in the early 1960s. And although it's a fictional novel, it includes so much of the reality of what was going on at that time, including the United Nations strafing a rescue mission trying to get civilians out of the line of fire in chaos, and the very destructive role played by the so-called United Nations peacekeeping force. I mean, there's another abuse of language. So the UN wrecked things so badly in the Congo that there's a book written, Fearful Master. And The Fearful Master by G. Edward Griffith, which is one of the books on my shelf, it comes from a quote from George Washington, first President of America. Government is not reason, government is force, and like a fire, it makes a dangerous servant and a fearful master. So just think in your house, if you've got a fireplace. A fire can be very helpful for warmth, for cooking. There's a lot of good things that fires can do, but it's a dangerous servant. If it gets out of the fireplace, if it gets to the furniture, if it gets to the carpets, if it gets to the curtains, well, of course, those are very flammable items, and especially curtains seem to always be made of flammable material for whatever reason. And the whole house is gone. So fire is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. Keep it in its place. Keep it in the hearth. Keep it there in the fireplace. It can't be even a few millimeters outside of its place. And so government is like fire. It's a dangerous servant. It might be a necessary servant, but it's a dangerous one. You've got to keep it in its place. If government gets out of its bounds, then the whole society is in danger. And what was documented in the Congo is the United Nations was a dangerous servant and a fearful master. So the title of the book is Fearful Master, because the UN in the Congo went out of control. And I was in Rhodesia at the time that this was happening, and we started to get refugees from the Congo. Belgian families coming into Rhodesia, kids sitting in desks next to me, relating what was going on in the Congo. And at that time, the most popular movies were The Man from U.N.C.L.E., a Russian and an American secret agent working together under the United Nations, the men from U.N.C.L.E., to keep the world safe from democracy. That was the Hollywood film. Well, the reality is they weren't keeping the world safe for anything except for crime and corruption. The UN forces were literally looting the homes of the Belgian settlers who'd been living there, literally taking their, not just their furniture, but their refrigerators, all that, packing them into C-130 planes to ship back to their home country, American pilots being the transport for them, to take their loot home. And so you had Pakistani, Moroccan, Swedish, and other so-called UN peacekeepers who were looting the Congo, stripping people of their possessions, meaning like, man and his wife trying to escape from the Congo chaos and flee across the borders to northern Rhodesia, and taking wedding rings, engagement rings, necklaces off the poor lady. In some cases, as the book documents, shooting whole families. You're talking about European settlers trying to flee the Congo, Belgians and so on. And there's a picture of this poor man who had his entire family wiped out in his little VW Beetle by these Pakistani soldiers who shot them up in the name of the UN. And the only survivor was his dog and himself. The rest of his family lost. Many people lost their whole families there in the Congo, and the United Nations did a lot of it. There's pictures in the Fearful Master book of bombed churches, bombed hospitals with the Red Crosses painted on top, bombed shopping centers, bombed schools, bombed by the United Nations we're talking about, not by the rebels, so-called. And in Katanga, which is the southernmost state of the Congo, the people in the Katanga seceded from the government. They called it, "We are seceding from chaos." Moise Chombe was the president of the southern province, and Katanga just wanted to be left alone. But the United Nations had to invade them. Not just UN forces, but American pilots flying them. And they came into Katanga and they just looted, burned, raped, murdered, massacred. And the UN charter is meant to prevent them from getting involved in the internal affairs of countries. But they just blatantly ignored their own charter and did the dirty work for the communists and helping the communists gain control of Katanga, which is a pro-Western, Christian, stable society. They wrecked Katanga to such an extent they had to change the name to the Shaba province for a while, just like the Congo became so synonymous with savagery and massacres and communism. They changed the name to Zaire for a few decades, hoping that people would forget what had happened to Congo. But changing a name doesn't change anything of substance. So yes, to try and understand what's gone on in the Congo was chaos. It was civilized by Henry Morton Stanley and some very dedicated people and missionaries like C.T. Studd and others who came in and at great sacrifice, at great risk, converted the cannibals and brought stability, civilization, schools, hospitals, medicine, advanced farming techniques, ended the starvation and other things that were rampant there, and brought the Congo into civilization and laid foundation for tremendous growth of the church. Then the Americans sabotaged the stability of the Congo by bullying the Belgians out. The Belgians were one nation that the Americans had liberated, apparently, and now they liberated the Congo from civilization and order and turned it into a chaotic playground for the superpowers, with the Soviets, the Chinese, and the Americans sponsoring different sides. And finally, an American agent, Mobutu Sese Seko, who was once head of the army, became the kleptomaniac who called himself president, and he looted the country so badly. At one time, a journalist asked Mobutu Sese Seko, "How is it possible that you're the fifth richest person in the world, but your country is the fourth poorest?" He says, "No, I'm the fourth richest man in the world," which kind of strongly supported the journalist's point. So that's the kind of chaos that happened in Congo. And so what we're seeing now is the residue of this decades of chaos and disruption of a country that had 60 years of civilization under Belgium, and now they've had 60 years of absolute pandemonium and chaos since they were liberated and given independence. And the Red Chinese have been having a lot of fun, looting the forest, looting the minerals, and any other raw materials that they've got to offer. The Americans have been playing in the whole game as well, but the poor people of Congo have suffered, and the United Nations has got their biggest peacekeeping operation in the Congo. And there's not much to show for it. What has the United Nations contributed to the Congo? Well, speaking to people on the ground, they've contributed a huge amount of venereal disease and STDs and AIDS, and they have prostituted the local population, they have raped, they have looted, they've murdered. The UN activities in the Congo are so staggeringly disgusting, it defies belief. You just cannot possibly exaggerate the mess they've made in that place. And to think the United Nations has the audacity to call themselves a peacekeeping force. They have made the place an absolute disaster beyond what it was before. And just the recent fighting is a case in point. And in many cases, you've got the rebels, so-called, like M23, behaving far better than the UN or the government forces. And, you know, again, who the rebels, who the forces, and as for the international peacekeepers, there is no peace to keep. They'd have to be peacemakers, but they can't even do that. So, yes, what's going on in the Congo, I'm sorry I can't be more coherent about it because I'm describing something so incoherent and chaotic. It's hard to do justice to it. But yes, so you've got shelling of cities, you've got destruction of whole areas, and it seems in many cases like the government forces that at one stage liberated Goma, the last time the government force came in, they basically were indiscriminately shooting into civilians. So, you know, again, who the rebels, who's the government forces? The UN peacekeepers have caused as much mass murder as any rebels could have possibly done. And we've got some of the insights from our good friends, the Boyds, John and Tanya Boyd, were of Missionary Aviation Fellowship. They went to the Congo and served there for 6 weeks before the whole of their airbase went up in flames. The flagship of Missionary Aviation Fellowship in eastern Congo burned up as looting, rampaging fighters came through. And again, you know, were they government, were they rebels? You know, well, what's the difference in some cases? Except that the rebels are normally better behaved than the government forces.
Frontline Fellowship has a missionary up in eastern Congo at this point in time. Is there any danger for Johan?
Definitely there's danger. We shouldn't let up in our prayers and support because Kisangani isn't that far from Goma. And he's in Kisangani, the old Stanleyville, which is the highest navigatable point in the Congo River. And he's setting up a Congo River mission. So, yes, Johan has got a very dangerous neighborhood to work in. But bear in mind, there's 18 million people in the Congo River basin living on the banks of the river or its tributaries who can only be reached by river. There are no roads there. There's no air bases. There's no airports. There's no other way to reach these people except by a river. And so you're talking about 18 million people, very few of which have access to any church or Bible, and they're one of the big unreached people group areas in the world, and the logistics is huge. There's a huge river, and it cuts everything, and it's in dense rainforest. There's no roads, there's no other way to reach them. If you don't have an outboard motor and a ship, you can't reach them. So we need to be able to support Johan to be able to get the outboard motor he needs, to get the satellite phone communications he needs, and to be able to stay in there and distribute Bibles, audio Bibles as well, and visual outreach materials like flip charts and the man in the box who speaks my language, the gospel proclaimers into the hands of these people. So Johan is in the area. He's not directly in a war zone, but the war zone is right adjacent to where he is. It could easily spill over. So at this precise moment, he's safe in Kisangani. But you can't be sure that the situation isn't going to be fluid and change pretty quickly. Personally, though, he might be in more danger from the government forces than from the rebels, because the government forces seem to just be bribe hungry. As he reported, in one 5-kilometer stretch of road, he went through 5 roadblocks, each demanding bribes, which on principle he won't pay.
Is there any long-term solution for the conflict in the Congo, Dr. Hammond?
I would say there's no political solution. I don't see a military solution either, but I do see a gospel solution. If we can fulfill the Great Commission, if we can do a thorough job of evangelizing and discipling the population on the ground, then I see a long-term solution able to develop. But unless we win Congo for Christ, I don't see a long-term solution. Right now it's like cannibals and communists for Christ. But what we need is we need a Congo that's not communist or cannibalistic. We need a Congo which is Christian. And that's going to take a lot of hard work. We need more evangelists. We need more disciples. We need more Bible teachers, Sunday school teachers. We need Bibles, audio Bibles, Bibles in indigenous languages, Bibles in French. Of course, the national language in Congo is French. The Belgians brought that and made it the national language. So if any of our listeners are French-speaking and you want a missionary challenge, then you're already speaking the language most of the people in Congo understand, because that's been the language of the schools for over 100 years. So the long-term solution is evangelism. And if we can fulfill the Great Commission in the Congo River Basin, can make a huge difference. The people need education, but they need more than education, they need evangelism. That will empower the people of the Congo to build up communities, even self-defense communities, that can create some order and stability in the very remote areas we're talking about. I mean, this is part of the rainforest. This is rainforest. This is a water catchment area. This is a very wild area. You know, if you think of the Congo, you start thinking gorillas, you think crocodiles, you think all kinds of snakes, and they've got the gaboon viper and a whole lot of extremely poisonous snakes there. And there's no amount of wild animals in the jungle, and who knows what can come out of that. But it's a wild country, and the people are even more wild than the wildlife in the jungle. So, yes, the long-term solution is Congo for Christ. We need to get very serious about Great Commission. I think what Johan's trying to pioneer is the right way to go. I think sending up South African soldiers up there is the wrong way to go. I don't think that the militaries have made the situation any better up there. The people are probably somewhat better off under their own tribal system than they are under the so-called UN peacekeeping force. And long-term solution, I don't think I've heard anything that resembles a possible solution politically or socially or even militarily. It's got to be spiritual.
Where can listeners learn more about the Congo and how we can positively and practically help in the situation?
Well, so if a person wants to get a shock introduction to the savagery of the Congo, they might want to read The Dark of the Sun book of Wilbur Smith, or see the film The Dark of the Sun, which also was released as The Mercenary or Last Train Out. And it's there's even a German version as well, and there's a French version of it, The Dark of the Sun. It's quite brutal, but it's a realistic insight into what the society was like in the wake of so-called independence in 1960 and the dastardly activities even of the United Nations in adding to the suffering of the poor refugees and frustrating attempts of people trying to rescue these civilians from the savagery of the so-called Simbas, who were stooges for the Red Chinese and so on. But we've got on the Frontline Mission SA.org website some articles on the Congo, like on our successful biblical worldview seminar we had there several years ago. And you can see some of the vision of Johan Meintjes and his Congo River mission. So visit the www.frontlinemissionsa.org website. That should be part of it. Also getting the Operation World International Prayer Book for the World. Operation World gives us the situation spiritually. I mean, just for example, do you know that there are something in the region of 8 million Roman Catholics in the Congo, which is quite staggering. 2.3 million Presbyterians, for example. There's 1.5 million Methodists. Baptists are over 1 million, and that's the group that I know Johanna is working with at the moment. When you get to understand the spiritual need in the Congo, and you can probably get the best insight from Operation World's chapter on the Congo, DRC being short for Democratic Republic of the Congo. But remember, whenever it says democratic, it isn't. And so, yes, you can contact Frontline, get hold of that, get on the newsletter for Frontline Mission and of Johan Meintjes, the missionary in the Congo right now. He needs volunteers, he needs co-workers, he needs spiritual warfare warriors behind him. He needs a 15 horsepower Yamaha outboard motor for his boat to be able to go up and down the Congo and deliver the Bibles and be able to minister in the different villages in these inaccessible areas. And of course, he'll need quite a lot of volunteers to come and help. So that's just practicalities. There's somebody there that one can build a team of volunteers around who might want to donate some of their time. All one's got to do is get to Kisangani, and believe it or not, there are flights into Kisangani, and there's a lot of actual activity going on in the city. It's quite advanced, surprisingly, in the cities, even if you've got to bring your own infrastructure. And by that we mean we bring our own water purification systems, we bring in our own generators, because you don't expect electricity from the government. The government is it's a failed state. But still, if a person wants pioneer missionary activity, here it is. On the Congo River, we've got a chance to reach villages who in many cases have never heard the gospel, or none of the young people have heard the gospel. Some of the older people might have. And so this is pretty pioneer work. And if somebody's interested in that, maybe some congregations would like to adopt the Congo as a project. It's certainly a very ambitious project. It's interesting that only a naval man like Johan Meintjes has volunteered so far, and he's gone there. He's gone the full length of the Congo River, which is quite spectacular if you think about what that involves. He went thousands of kilometers there, mapping so much of it and documenting what's where, building relationships in order to help in the fulfillment of this project. I don't know anyone else who's gone the full length of the Congo River, and that's quite a spectacular achievement already. But he's there. He drove up from South Africa, up through Zimbabwe, Zambia, Tanzania, Burundi, Rwanda. He's in the Congo with his vehicle, and he's at the headwaters of the Congo River and ministering in churches already. But he says there's about 14,000 kilometers of shoreline on the Congo River and its tributaries, with 18 million people who need to be reached. I mean, that's a vision. That's massive need. So if any one of our listeners is tired of ministering to the people who are bored and unresponsive, and you want to minister to people who literally have never heard the gospel before or have nothing, and when we say nothing, we mean nothing, like they don't have plumbing, they don't have electricity, these people are remote, they're desolate, they live off fish they catch in the river, and that's about the only meal they ever get. Most of them don't even know about agriculture. They're not living off any vegetables, they're just living off fish. That's their only source of nutrition, and you can just imagine that's not healthy. You need to also have vegetables, but he said we need farmers who know how to teach farming God's way to get the villagers into growing their own vegetables. It's very, very fertile ground, obviously. It's very well watered. You've got no problem with needing irrigation or anything like that. This is the rainforest. This is a good place to start a vegetable garden, but most people don't know about it, he says. So there's a lot to learn about the Congo, and there are some great books on the Congo historically. Some missionaries have worked there. New Tribes Mission and others have done a spectacular work in the Congo over the years. But it's the river that provides a tremendous obstacle course. And I think what Johanna, as a naval man, has done is he sees the Congo River not as an obstacle, but as God's highway to share the gospel with communities that can't be reached any other way. And that was also a vision of David Livingstone. He didn't see the rivers as much as an obstacle as a pathway to share the gospel to remote areas. And that's a wonderful, wonderful vision for today. And with all the negatives that's going on in South Africa, sending more troops into Congo, well, how much better to send more missionaries into Congo?
Thank you, Dr. Hammond, for a fascinating insight into the Congo, its history and current affairs. We pray for the success and safety of Jan Meintjes. In closing, I'd like to read from 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 1 to 2. Finally, brethren, pray for us that the word of the Lord may run swiftly and be glorified, just as it is with you, and that we may be delivered from unreasonable and wicked men, for not all have faith. Thank you very much for joining us for From the Front Line. God bless and good night.